Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. One of the primary laws of all conditioned phenomena is the reality of change. Things are constantly coming into existence, going out of existence. In human life, we have a cycle from birth through childhood, adolescence, adulthood, old age, and death. All things that we know in the conditioned world are in a constant state of change, becoming other than they were. Nothing is the same from moment to moment. Now, there is a peculiar psychological reality that generally beings don't like change. Find it difficult to deal with. I've seen psychological studies that say that that the biggest stress factors are when there's some major change in your life, and it isn't necessarily a negative change. If you come into a large sum of money or get married or something that we would consider like a positive change, that's also a stress factor for people, let alone negative changes like a death in the family or a financial collapse. Those are obviously stress factors, but any major change people perceive as a stress factor. This is part of being a sentient being in samsara, in conditioned reality, is that we constantly have to navigate this changing situation. And it's futile and a cause of suffering if you try to base your happiness on keeping things the same, trying to stop change from happening, because you can't. You never, you can never prevent that from happening, and it'll just cause you unnecessary unhappiness and suffering if you're investing your well-being in a stable situation that can't be found. We become very attached to conditions, even if they're not ideal. You become attached and comfortable with the misery that you know. They say that if somebody's been in prison for a long period of time, when they get out, it's very stressful and unhappy for them, because their routine is totally changed. I think we see this kind of psychological reaction on all levels of being. It was brought to my attention very recently at New Year's Eve. We had our program here in the evening, and when I got back to my cabin after midnight, my cat was all freaked out. It took her a long time to settle down, and it's not because anything bad had happened, just something different. The day had not gone as usual, so this is very upsetting. And we notice that on the human level all the time, that we become attached to our routines, our daily routines, and our ways of doing things, and when they're changed up, then we can become upset. That's why in our tradition we generally don't accept for ordination anybody over the age of 50, because as you get older you become more fixed in your ways and attached to your routines. I certainly have to notice that in my own being. If something is a little bit off from my daily routine, how easily that can be a cause of dukkha and upset, in the mind. You just have to watch that and not go with it. It said that when the Buddha goes up to the Dewa realm and preaches there, many of the Dewas become very upset and frightened because they hear for the first time that our existence is not permanent, it's not unchanging, and they becomes a great source of fright for them, even though their lifespans are, in human terms, they're millions of years long. They're still subject to that changing and ending. There actually can be a very spiritually beneficial aspect to changing up. That it's one of the mental hindrances or traps that we get into is this attachment to things remaining the same. And if you're thrown into a new situation, things are very different. It can be upsetting and frightening perhaps at first, but it can be very liberating. It shakes up your old patterns and lets you break new ground. I think that was something I found very beneficial about going to Thailand and ordaining as a bhikkhu when I did, at that point in my life and in my spiritual condition, that it was like a total immersion in a completely new culture, new routine, new food. It's everything totally different. I think that was a huge factor in making that a beneficial experience. Getting pushed or tossed out of your comfort zone can be very useful. And it's certainly the case that most of the religious systems that have existed, whether in ancient times in ancient India or down to the present day, they like to postulate some kind of unchanging state as the end point, some kind of blissful eternal existence. This is not possible, that there could be a state of existence that continuing in an unchanging condition. This is just the fact of being in existence is to be subject to change. What the Buddha taught was subtly different in important ways. He taught that the point is not, as in other systems, the point was always to get the most ideal conditioned state, some state of existence that's blissful and unchanging. As the Buddha said, the point is to get out of the cycle of existence altogether and realize the unconditioned nibbana, which you could very loosely say it's a different mode of being, but even that is not quite right, because it transcends the concepts of being and not being. So the fact of change and impermanence is not applicable to the unconditioned. It's a factor of the conditioned only. And being in some kind of manifest form, whether as an animal or a human or a dewa, is to be conditioned, so as to be subject to constant change. And while we're in this conditioned state, it's very important to understand those laws. If you understand the laws, then you can greatly reduce your degree of suffering in this existence by not expecting things to remain the same, to become comfortable with change rather than to try and stop change from happening. The Taoists talk about that a lot, like this, the idea of going with the flow, or bending with the wind, not resisting. Like the windstorm comes and the mighty oaks get their branches torn off, but the frail willows bend with the wind and then come back after the storm. This idea of change is an aspect of anicca, one of the three characteristics, there being dukkha, anicca, anatta, and all conditioned phenomena are subject to these three characteristics. That is the suffering aspect, or unsatisfying or imperfect. This is dukkha. The impermanent or changeable aspect is anicca, and the void or not self or empty aspect is anatta. No intrinsic self-substance. Things don't exist from their own side. And all conditioned things are subject at every moment to these three laws. The unconditioned is not subject to dukkha or anicca, but it is also not self. It's empty, void. So this means that sunya, emptiness, is the most universal characteristic. It applies to both the conditioned and the unconditioned. And it should be our goal to be moving towards a loosening of the bonds of samsaric conditioned existence in order to realize the unconditioned. But for a long time we have to deal with conditioned reality and live in the world subject to those laws of conditionality. And to understand them is to have some space, some psychic space in that. We don't have to feel oppressed by it. It's just things as they are, and we navigate in that reality. It's like a dance. We're dealing with the changing flow of phenomena and not allowing ourselves to suffer unnecessarily by being attached to what we want to be unchanging, which can never be. This is also related to the attachment to a sense of security or safety. That we want things to be safe and secure. We don't want to be, under threat or peril, which is understandable and sensible as far as it goes. But the reality is we're not ever completely secure. We cannot be completely safe or secure. Things are always precarious. It's the nature of the human form to be frail and subject to illness and injury. It's the nature of conditions to be constantly changing. I remember on one of my trips down east with Ajahn Amaro in a car, we were being given a tour of Boston, city of Boston, and somebody pointed out some big skyscrapers and an insurance building. The insurance industry is real big in Boston. And this building was apparently built on a bog, and it's been a problem ever since it was built. It's slowly tilting over, and at some point it's going to be useless. It's not very evident that it's tilting yet, but it's just slowly subsiding into the bog. And Ajahn Amaro thought that was hilarious. That institution insurance is like to try to make you feel safe and secure, and it's built on a bog, sinking to the bog. And it's like that everywhere, that we're uh, as human beings, we're always trying to build up structures, institutions, and physical structures to protect us and secure us, and it's never only a partial or temporary fix. We have to know that things are going to change, that the body ages, the material conditions change, the external conditions change constantly, and this is all according to cause and condition. But what also makes it tricky to navigate is because the causes and conditions are so complex, we can't ever understand them fully, so they're essentially unpredictable. In mathematical terms, reality is chaotic but not random. It's a constantly changing constellation of patterns, and it's so complex that we can't fully predict what's going to happen, even though it's not random. It's following its own laws. Now, talking about change, which is certainly an idea that's been found outside of Buddhism. We have the ancient Greek philosopher Heraclitus, who said you cannot step into the same river twice. It's a very elegant expression of that. And that image of the constantly flowing river is something that's found in many traditions. That the river as a symbol of change, the constant movement of the water down the river. But we could also note a paradoxical approach to this, in that we could say quite precisely in interpreting Abhidhamma that actually nothing ever changes. The idea in Abhidhamma is that the only actual reality are momentary dhammas, that reality is kind of an atomic idea, that reality is composed of these point instances of reality, and they exist only for a moment. And during that moment, they don't experience any growth or change or decay or dissolution. They just exist as they are for a moment, and then are replaced in the subsequent moment by a new reality. So the macro level, we see constant change, but at the immediate momentary level, there's just things as they are at this moment. This is also an expression from Abhidhamma based on this idea, is that motion is impossible, because what we perceive as motion is only subsequent arising at adjacent locations. So when you move your arm, when you wave your arm, nothing is actually moving from place to place. The individual dhammas, the kalapas, the aggregates of the four elements, which in modern terms we talk about atoms and molecules. So they had this similar kind of a view of matter. These individual components flash in and out of existence momentarily, and as you move your arm, the dhammas that constitute the arm are just rematerializing in new locations along the arc of your movement. So this is another aspect of anicca. We have, I was up till now talking about change as an aspect of anicca. And other aspect is transience or momentariness, which is the deepest understanding of anicca, is the effervescence, the momentary flashing in and out of existence of individual dhammas. And this is what constitutes reality at the deepest level. Our perceptual reality blurs that into perceiving of things persisting and moving and changing gradually. This is only a result of the individual dhammas following their intrinsic laws. It's a mark of the orderliness of the conditioned world. That dhammas which arise are not just random, then there would be no structure. There would just be a constant flashing in and out of random events, but instead they follow orderly process of cause and effect. So we perceive that as continuity. And this perception of continuity is what masks or hides from ordinary understanding the idea of impermanence, of anicca. As we perceive things as being continuous, and this fools us into seeing things as lasting and abiding. Some things are more obviously transient or impermanent, like sparks coming from a fire, or like soap bubbles, things that's obviously impermanent, but all things are actually the same in this regard, transient and impermanent. The Buddha used in one discourse, he used the image of Mount Sinnaru as an emblem of that which human beings mistakenly perceive as stable and permanent. It's like this massive, unbelievably massive, solid mountain in the center of the universe. It's been unchanging since primordial time. But the Buddha says actually the day will come when it's ground to dust. Whatever we take in our own opinion as being something impermanent, unchanging, it's not. It's always subject to that breaking up, falling away, changing. And certainly we have now in modern times, we have a quite different model of the earth and the universe, but this still very much incorporates the idea of change. The continents are moving around, and the sun is gradually changing its nature as it burns up its fuel, and so on. That nothing is actually the same moment to moment. And this sense of impermanence is something that we can look to understanding on all these different levels in dealing with our own situation, our personal life, our issues, our relationships and struggles. Understanding the law of impermanence can make that easier, because we can expect things to change and we negotiate the change rather than fight it. We learn to dance in it. On a spiritual level, penetrating the true reality of impermanence is one of the three characteristics. And the three characteristics, when they're penetrated in depth, they become gateways, the gateways of liberation. So it's seen in the mind as this constant coming in and out of existence of individual dhammas. This is what insight or vipassana is working towards, this state of seeing reality as it actually is on a momentary level. And if we can get that close to that, seeing this momentary nature of reality, that becomes the gateway of liberation that's called the signless liberation, the animitta. Animitta is a mind-created object. Nimitta means something that is created, and the implication is something created by the mind. So in the technical meditation sense, a nimitta is an object that the mind creates, is held as a meditation object and leads into jhana. And we talk about nimittas in terms of usually a visual object like a disc or a point of light. But there's also physical, tactile nimittas, like the breath at the nose tip becomes a nimitta when it becomes fully stabilized there. It could be a nimitta of sound. As Ajahn Sumedho talks about the sound of silence, meditating on the inner sound. This becomes a nimitta because these are all mind-created objects. But the liberation through impermanence is the signless. It's animitta, no nimitta. Because a nimitta is something that's used as a meditation object that is stable. And when there's no stability, when this total transience is perceived directly, then there can be no place for a nimitta. So it's a signless liberation. Any kind of nimitta is breaking up. And when the reality of impermanence is encountered in a visceral way for the first time, it can be a frightening experience. This sense of the body and mind breaking up even as we look at it, that it's in a state of disintegration. In the stages of insight, there are a number of stages well along, like towards the point when you're approaching equanimity of formations. You go through a number of stages where you're encountering samsara in its raw form. Well, the rose-colored glasses are gone, and you're seeing phenomena breaking up and falling away, and it can be frightening. These stages are named like the knowledge of terror, the knowledge of misery. In other spiritual traditions, they talk about the dark night of the soul. This is the kind of the confrontation with reality, but not yet seen past it. And at that stage, it requires perseverance, but more importantly, it requires courage. That you keep going on regardless. I have this kind of a warrior spirit. That you don't back down. Just keep going forward, and coming out from the other side of that is equanimity of formations, when the mind is completely at peace, and it's like a change, a fundamental change in attitude. It's like everything is breaking up and falling away and disintegrating. Oh no, this is terrible. Everything is falling apart, breaking up, falling away. Oh, that's it. That's the way it is. I'll just sit here. That's fine. I'm at peace. It's okay. That's the state of mind. That's the furthest point you can reach by striving. And it's not yet full awakening. It's not the realization of nibbana, but it's the place from which that can occur, and only from that state. So this is the value of the spiritual quality of equanimity, which, bringing it around back to where we started, talking about dealing with change and being comfortable with change, the key factor in that is equanimity. Now, the idea of equanimity is that you're not perturbed by external conditions. That whatever occurs is just what is, whether it's wonderful or terrible or somewhere in between. You just are there. That's what is on your agenda at this moment. You deal with it from a place of calm and peace and stability. And that's the way we negotiate our way through the constantly changing internal and external conditions.
Dharmayam Dharmakataya Sadhu Kalam Dharmasay Sadhu 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 Sadhu